Most Americans don't actually know very much about the Revolutionary War. Sure, I mean, most of us could tell you about the tea in the harbor and Paul Revere, maybe about some Minutemen here and there, the Declaration of Independence, the villainous traitor Benedict Arnold, Lord Cornwallis surrendering at Yorktown, but these are all kind of just details, right? Our average understanding of this pivotal moment in our history amounts more to seeing a collection of individual brushstrokes rather than a fully painted canvas. I mean, what caused the Revolutionary War? Unjust taxation without representation is what we're usually taught. And yeah, I would agree that that was the short-term trigger that kicked off hostilities. But what were the broad historical conditions and circumstances which allowed this revolution to take place? And what's more, to succeed? Most schools don't really teach us the full story of the founding of this country, and a robust understanding of our revolution is pretty conspicuously absent from our pop culture, that void being filled with sketchy, vague ideas about fighting tyranny and well-regulated militias and USA, USA. And I'd humbly submit that this is kind of by design. The United States of America is an extraordinary country, as are the values upon which it was founded. But it didn't emerge from a vacuum. Liberal democracy was not a new idea in 1776. Certain forms of it had been thriving on the east coast of this continent for more than a century beforehand. And if we want to understand how, we've got to go back to the 17th century and talk about everybody's favorite sex-deprived weirdos, the Puritans. But real quick, before we do, I just wanted to show you my costume closet. Check it out. Here's all your favorite little guys. Here's the Witchfinder General. Here's Klaus. Here's Johnny Reb, Billy Yank. And here's some Revolutionary War stuff that I got custom made for my coverage of the topic. As well as this linen getup that I got on right now. The wig is from the finest Halloween store in town. And as you can imagine, a lot of this stuff is not exactly cheap. I just got back from a meeting with my accountant, actually, and she told me that Atunche Films LLC spends 65% of its income on production expenses. Extra videos. So you may have heard about how in the early 17th century, Puritan separatists in England and the Netherlands had reached an ideological impasse with King James I and the Anglican Church. Life in the Old World was becoming spiritually intolerable. And besides, God wanted his true saints to spread knowledge of Christ to the darkest, most demonic corner of the world, the Metro West area of Boston, and there establish a new Jerusalem whose shining example would become a kind of metaphysical apocalypse bunker for the imminent end of days. All that is certainly true, but what often goes unremarked upon are the economic factors that underlied this revolutionary act. Puritan immigrants to New England were almost exclusively commoners. And crucially, most were part of a rising middle class of yeoman farmers, artisans, and guild merchants, whose wealth and productivity was beginning to challenge, even eclipse, that of the landed feudal nobility. Since the vast majority of international commerce centered in cities, the merchant class had begun in the Middle Ages as an urban phenomenon in places like the Italian city-states. It's no accident that the republics of Venice and Genoa were established by merchants. In places where the merchant class gained ascendance over the nobility, republican government was almost always sure to follow. But by the 17th century, the fruits and opportunities of global colonization had expanded the mercantile middle class out of the cities and into virtually every aspect of European life. However, this middle class still retained a vestigial remnant of their origins in their name. Burgesses in English, Burger in German, Borgesia in Italian, and bourgeoisie in French. That prefix burg, which pops up in English too, as in Pittsburgh, usually means town or fort or castle, and bourgeoisie literally translates to town dwellers. But the old feudal order wasn't going down without a fight. As the Burgesses amassed huge fortunes and all the influence that came with them, kings across Europe consolidated their power under this hot new philosophy called absolutism. In England, King James, and especially his son King Charles, became unprecedentedly despotic. and encouraged an exclusionary culture among the nobility, drawing hard social lines between the God-chosen people with the magic blood and the tacky, nouveau riche upstarts of the merchant class. And as England became more and more inhospitable for the burgesses in the 1620s and 30s, many of them decided to pull up stakes and head across the ocean to North America. Among them were some of the most legendary names in New England history. John Winthrop, the founder of Massachusetts, was the grandson of a master of the clothworkers, one of London's biggest craft guilds. Likewise, Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, came from a middle-class merchant family. His father was also a member of one of the top London guilds. And despite the Plymouth Pilgrims' well-recorded distaste for, in Edward Winslow's words, the vain expectation of profit, the Mayflower expedition was financed by wealthy merchant adventurers under a corporate charter. That's not to say that Puritan religion, and all the anti-authoritarianism that came along with it, was insincere, or somehow a cynical cover for the settlers' crude economic interest. When your elementary school history teacher told you something vague and oversimplified about how early settlers came over for more opportunity and a better life, she wasn't entirely wrong. The merchant class was facing genuine persecution in England, both religiously and economically, and many rank-and-file Puritan immigrants correctly recognized that the colonies were a path toward upward mobility. Many of England's feudal tenants and small-time landowners became New England's magisterial, mercantile, and clerical elite. Who on earth can blame them for wanting to get out from under the thumb of outdated, arbitrary tyranny and improve their situation in life? My point is that when we cut through all the mythologizing about Plymouth Rock and turkey dinners and pumpkin pie, we find that there's a material root to this ideology of religious freedom that we've been told so much about. The Puritan push for a more democratized religious and political system in England stemmed from their frustration as a class, that despite their growing wealth and influence, they continued to be excluded from the social prestige and civic power of the nobility. And when this simmering anxiety not only went unaddressed, but actively suppressed by absolutist politics, it finally exploded into violence with the English civil wars between king and parliament. But there was a problem. To paraphrase historian Neil Davidson, radical Puritanism was an excellent battering ram for destroying the fortifications of feudalism. It proved much less effective as scaffolding to construct a new liberal order. Now, don't get me wrong, and I'm sure my longtime subscribers are kind of sick of hearing about this, but something they don't really teach us in American schools is that Puritanism was the wellspring of some of our most foundational ideas about liberalism. I mean, universal male suffrage, republican government, consent of the governed, all of that stuff was originally their idea, at least in the English-speaking world. Our culture implicitly encourages us to believe that these ideas just popped into existence during the American Revolution. The Founding Fathers had a unique genius and were bringing something unprecedented and utterly novel into the world. But that's just not true at all. The Puritans came up with this stuff more than 100 years prior. The world just wasn't quite ready for it yet. And perhaps more to the point, the Puritans themselves were ideologically ill-equipped in bringing it about. Their first principle was morality and godliness. They were an apocalypse cult. Whether in England or America, they thought their cultural political dominance was a harbinger of the end times. And apocalypse cults aren't exactly the best long-term planners. Revolutions are systems failures, and successful revolutions can't just overthrow the current system of power. They have to provide a viable alternative. In order to challenge the state, revolutionaries need to build extrajudicial, extra-statist power structures of their own, which can pick up where the old regime leaves off. As a decentralized, bottom-up social movement, Puritanism lacked the concrete power structures necessary to retain long-term rule after they overthrew and beheaded King Charles I. Hence, we had the so-called Commonwealth of England, 20 years of hard-handed Puritan military dictatorship before the restoration of King Charles II in 1660. But you know who did have concrete extra-statist power structures? The secular merchant guilds, who were less interested in morality than they were in enterprise. Their first principle was making money. The Puritans restructured the English state into a vehicle for bringing about the New Jerusalem, a fundamentally irrational goal that proved unsustainable. The merchants had a different vision. restructuring the state into a vehicle for facilitating commerce. And they had the organizational power to do it. So, after a brief but similarly disastrous return to absolutism with Charles II and James II, the secular burgesses finished the process that the Puritans had started with the decisive Glorious Revolution of 1688, which established stable parliamentary rule under a neutered monarchy, enshrined liberal legal principles in an English Bill of Rights, and forever cemented the primacy of a capitalist economy in the British Isles. The burgesses now had unquestioned cultural dominance, and were given carte blanche to pursue a policy of infinite economic growth as they plied the global market. It's no accident that the new monarch, William III, was from the Netherlands, the first truly capitalist country. The Dutch had separated church and state, by state read commerce, and encouraged freedom of expression and religion. Religious extremism, whether Catholic or Calvinist, was simply bad for business. Monarchies weren't necessarily a deal breaker, as long as they weren't absolutist. Kings and queens could dress up in jewels and capes and prance around all they liked, just as long as they understood who was really in charge. So I realize that I often have a bit of a flair for the dramatic in the way that I phrase things, and you might be forgiven for thinking that I'm trying to infer some sort of negative moral judgment on England's transition from feudalism to capitalism, but that is the opposite of my intent. I would maintain that this transition was an objectively good thing for England and its people. Liberal capitalism was a highly effective, highly productive system of power. It worked so well, in fact, that from 1688 to 1763, Britain handily outcompeted the absolutist monarchies of France and Spain to become the largest and most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Capitalists' goal was to make money, and by gad, they made all the money. More money than anyone in the history of the world had ever even dreamed of. Feudalism was old and doddering, and wasn't built to navigate a global market. And while the erratic ambitions of deranged kings bankrupted France time and time again, hard-headed British and Dutch merchants built a sleek new institutional framework of production, which transformed wealth into investment capital. And again, liberalism gave us the concept of human rights as we know them today. These were unequal societies, to be sure, but let's not lose sight of the fact that the people living under capitalism were objectively freer, more prosperous, and enjoyed a higher quality of life than people living under feudalism. This was a huge leap forward, folks. Just objectively, one of the most profoundly progressive events in human history. There was just one problem. A system of infinite economic growth requires infinite consumption of resources, and the grist for the early modern capitalist mill was colonial extraction. Liberal capitalism was a triumph for Europeans. For the indigenous people they conquered, the West Africans they enslaved, and the ecosystems they exploited, it was literally the worst thing that has ever happened. Separated by an ocean from the halls of power in Parliament, the 13 colonies of British America had largely been left to govern themselves during most of their history. By the so-called French and Indian War, power structures independent of the British government were already well entrenched in America. Power structures designed to advance transatlantic economic interests. And since liberal government exists primarily to enrich capitalists, there must necessarily be a fair bit of flexibility within that ideology to accommodate the very different types of economic activity occurring on the vast seaboard stretching from Georgia to Maine. New England's power structures were the closest to what comes to mind when we think of true democracy. The province of Massachusetts, for instance, was entirely self-governing from 1691 to 1774 through the General Court, a body of elected representatives from every town in the colony. Their decentralized government reflected their decentralized economy. Most production in New England occurred deep inland in the lumber industry or far out to sea in the fishing and whaling industries. The supply chain would then pass these commodities down to the major port cities, where merchants would buy them, pack them, and ship them overseas. The collectivist ideals of Puritan settlers had long since been replaced by capitalist individualism, but many vestigial traces remained. Local town government remained the backbone of political life. New Englanders were still all about that self-important city on a hill type stuff, and they definitely still hated Catholics, even if witch hunting and apocalypse prophecies had become somewhat passé. The mid-Atlantic colonies were a bit more of a mix of power structures, a mess of semi-feudal, semi-capitalist contradictions. In the countryside, Dutch patroons and British manor lords owned massive tracts of land worked by tenants and squatters. Ostensibly, these landlords were elected by freeholders, but in practice, they were hereditary positions. Meanwhile, the urban centers of New York City and Philadelphia were the apotheosis of early American capitalism. Diverse and cosmopolitan, these were major industrial centers and hubs of transatlantic trade. Influenced by Dutch rationalism and Quaker tolerance, they were also fiercely socially liberal, with long traditions of freedoms of speech, religion, and the press. New York and Pennsylvania were both ruled by a royal governor, but he shared power with legislatures dominated by wealthy local merchants. And on the bleeding edge of the liberal spectrum were the slave societies of the South. Obviously, Virginians didn't call one half of their bicameral legislature the House of Burgesses for nothing, but the extent to which the southern colonies were capitalist is highly debatable. During the English Civil Wars, the House of Burgesses had supported Parliament, but the General Assembly and the royal governor supported the monarchy. And in the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion, a late 17th century lower-class uprising against the planter elite, that same governor consolidated power within the General Assembly, which represented the interests of the most powerful plantation owners, setting the stage for the decidedly anti-democratic slaveholder oligarchy of the Old South. And as varied as these systems of power were, one thing united all of these different visions of American liberalism: their close proximity to the colonial project. From the very first liberal power structures ever devised in British North America, the direct democracies of Plymouth Colony and Massachusetts Bay, American liberalism was full of Puritan rhetoric about freedom, equality, and self-determination. Of course, simultaneously, these same colonists were hunting witches, executing religious dissidents, enslaving Africans, and committing genocide against Native Americans. Many people see this as a glaring paradox, a fundamental contradiction within the liberal American experiment. These people are missing the point. The system was working exactly as intended. There is no inconsistency here. Again, what is the point of liberalism? Why does it exist? Its function was to provide a state which would liberate the burgesses from feudalism and unleash the full potential of capitalist commerce. So you do have genuine freedom within a certain circle of privileged citizenry. It was a much bigger circle than feudalism's, and that's commendable, but it was still relatively small. In early New England, you had to be a white Puritan male to be within that circle. In the Mid-Atlantic, you had to be a white male landowner or merchant, but your religion didn't really matter as much. In the South, you had to be a plantation owner. Inside the circle, things were really nice, but the view outside the circle was that of a bristling phalanx that was coming for you and was gonna take all of your shit. American freedom was never meant to apply to everyone. Its economy was based on extraction. How on earth can an extractive economy really function if there actually is liberty and justice for all? We're often told that the American Revolution was primarily a conflict of ideologies. America was a liberal republic in the making that threw off the shackles of feudal tyranny, two fundamentally incompatible political systems whose coexistence had become intolerable. But I would contend that this is far from the truth. Instead, I see the 12 years of unrest and discord from 1763 to 1775 as a growing rift between two competing liberal power structures. I mean, I think there was more variation of liberal government within the colonies themselves than between, say, New York and London. But what set British liberalism apart was that it did double duty, both as a government by capitalists for capitalists and as a seat of imperial power. The British government had additional responsibilities that the governments of the 13 colonies simply did not. Among them, the defense and maintenance of a vast global empire. Up until the 7 Years' War, British and American power structures had been symbiotic, mutually beneficial, and broadly ideologically indistinguishable. But following the French defeat, their material interests no longer aligned. Bankrupted by the war, Parliament asserted their economic and political superiority over the colonies, instituting mercantilism abroad while enjoying the fruits of capitalism at home. They began to enforce customs regulations, which they had previously turned a blind eye to. They outlawed colonial paper money. They ordered colonial legislatures to provide funding for the regular military. And of course, they levied horrifically unpopular taxes, which, coming as they did during an economic downturn, hit the working class especially hard. But the colonists' first impulse was not to overthrow the government and declare independence. In the 1760s, the goal was simply to coerce Parliament into repealing the new impositions. Wealthy coastal merchants, for whom armed insurrection against the crown was as yet unthinkable, started boycotting British goods and sending formal petitions to London. And while the merchants exerted polite but firm pressure on British economic interests, radical populist groups emerged from the ranks of lower middle and working class colonists, smugglers, mechanics, artisans, and farmers, who were angry about their increasingly desperate economic circumstances. Foremost among them was the Boston chapter of the Sons of Liberty, led by the failed businessman and disaffected intellectual Samuel Adams. In the height of the crisis caused by the Stamp Act, Adams and his sons rioted, burned effigies in the streets, attacked the homes of customs officers, and destroyed legal records. A campaign of direct action so successful that during the summer of 1765, the Sons of Liberty were effectively in control of the city of Boston. And it worked. Parliament backed down and repealed the Stamp Act. But this only kicked the can down the road. The British government was still £130 million in debt, and they had to find that money somewhere. 2 years later, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, a series of duties on colonial imports, sparking a new wave of protests. Though they repeated the tried-and-true tactics of economic pressure and direct action, the Bostonians at the center of this resistance were eventually undercut by New York merchants, who broke the British boycott. Typical New York. Parliament had won this round, and what's more, they'd established the dominance of their mighty imperial power structures over the colonies' cute little provincial ones. Finally, in 1773, an emboldened Parliament enacted its most brazen mercantile outrage yet, giving the struggling East India Company a monopoly on American tea sales. The indomitable Sons of Liberty responded by boarding 3 ships moored in Boston Harbor and destroying over 92,000 pounds of East India Company tea. So, in 1774, George III declared to his Prime Minister Lord North that the New England colonies were in a state of rebellion, and sent troops to occupy Boston. The fuse of revolution had now been irrevocably lit. While traditional history marks the beginning of the War of Independence on April 19, 1775, with Lexington, Concord, and all that, a more appropriate start date might be September 5, 1774, the first meeting of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Though it was not yet a foregone conclusion that the political bands with Great Britain would be dissolved, this was still an explicitly revolutionary act. Violence is not necessarily what wins revolutions. What wins revolutions are viable alternate power structures, which run parallel to, then eventually overcome and replace, existing power structures. In November of that year, Congress called for, quote, committees in county, city, and town to organize and enforce its economic opposition to British policies. In places where the burgesses and planters already had anti-British economic interests, these committees were simply a continuation of rule by the old elite. But notably, in cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Albany, the committees were a popular movement of newly radicalized lower-class mechanics who were allied with, but not necessarily led by, politically sympathetic local merchants. These revolutionary committees were localized, but all followed a single continental strategy of economic sabotage. They were a solid organizational right flank, providing direction and focus for their paramilitary left flank made up of the Sons of Liberty and others, who seized and destroyed boycott-breaking goods and attacked the properties, reputations, and sometimes even persons of the merchants trading them. Of course, all this was highly illegal, and at first the committees met in secret at private homes and taverns. But as the crisis deepened and their momentum grew, the revolutionary movement began operating out in the open. In October 1774, John Hancock, Paul Revere, and other notable Boston organizers formed the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, the first official American counter-government. Since all political power flows from the barrel of a gun, one of their first orders of business was to assemble a loyal military force who could operate with impunity in areas outside of the control of the British Army. Backed by the various town militias of Middlesex County, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress opened jails, appointed officers of the peace, and summoned citizens to mandatory public meetings. By the spring of 1775, rural Massachusetts was firmly under the control of a revolutionary junta. I feel like a lot of people just assume that when the British marched to Concord, the populace was just so incensed by this flagrant display of military despotism that they spontaneously rose up, grabbed their muskets, kissed their beautiful blonde wives and lily-white children goodbye, and marched with steely resolve to the Old North Bridge and Lexington Town Common. But no, that's not quite how revolution works, is it? Without this extra-legal, extra-status power structure, there is no Lexington. There is no Concord. Successful revolutions are never spontaneous. They are all organized. Every single one. So thus, a radical populist movement, despite being an overall minority within the general population, was able to seize power in large swaths of the American colonies. Of course, it wasn't to last. The merchant class, always a bit uncomfortable with the fiercely democratic convictions of the revolutionary committees, staged an effective counter-revolution during the late 1770s, undermining the committees as early as 1776, before actively pushing them out of government by 1780. And by prioritizing the interests of the Burgess elite over mechanics and farmers, they set the stage for the chaos of the post-war Shays and Whiskey rebellions. But in 1775, all that was still far in the future. During this early stage, revolutionaries were united across class lines. Merchants, planters, and workers fighting shoulder to shoulder, despite the fact that the economic impacts of British mercantilism did not affect them equally. Why is that? Why were Americans so offended by British despotism that they were willing to go to extraordinary, revolutionary lengths to oppose it? Well, in addition to the material factors, there's also a powerful psychological reason. Americans were finally on the other end of the liberal phalanx for once. The privileged inner circle of British liberalism did not encompass the American colonists. They were not citizens, but subjects to be commanded, in much the same way that Americans considered indigenous people and Africans not as citizens, but as subjects, residing outside the phalanx of American liberalism. Ethnicity and religion were powerful indicators of in-group preference in the colonies, which were rife with white supremacy and anti-Catholic xenophobia. So within that culture, to degrade a proud Protestant white male citizen to the role of a subject was an outrage. British tyranny wasn't just economically disadvantageous. Suffering through it was actively shameful. So what is a gentleman to do when his honor is so affronted? Why, throw down his glove and issue a challenge, of course. Revolutions usually kick off during a swell of popular radicalism, which builds and builds and builds to a frenzy of irrational passion before exploding in a climax of violence. But then things spiral out of control, the human cost mounts, and a post-coital clarity sinks in, which often then leads to counter-revolution, or at the very least, moderate voices gaining influence in the movement. The Revolutionary War was no different in this regard. This happened to the Confederates in the American Civil War, when the fire-eating radicalism of naked white supremacy, which had seemed unstoppable in 1860, was a source of embarrassment to the political class by 1863. And leaders like Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, who had once played to the fire-eating crowd, later wisely soft-pedaled the role of slavery in secession to curry international support. But examining the rage militaire of a revolution can nonetheless be extremely useful, because the raw emotion of these periods tends to peel the onion of ideology and reveal the fundamental anxieties and psychological impulses beneath. And accounts by American revolutionaries at this time overwhelmingly point to a bone